Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Now I'll start the recording. Oh, I see Simone was just a step ahead of me. So the session is being recorded. Anybody who joins later can always come back and catch up on any parts they've missed. So first of all, welcome everyone. Welcome to this leadership team training. My name is Rob Clark. I've been working at TSB for the last 15 years. My role involves a little bit of project coordination and a little bit of support directly to the standardization work. The material that we've got today has been compiled over some years based on TSAG chairs and presentations given at WTSA to new chairmen. So I hope the material has a solid foundation. I hope it's well structured and easy to follow, and I'm very happy to take you through it. And also at any point, please feel free to interrupt, to ask any questions you might have. We often find that the questions that you ask bring out information that's of particular relevance for you as a group of experts working in, for example, Study Group 16. So please interrupt me at any time if you like. You're welcome to jump in on the audio. We also have a new request for the floor feature on the left-hand side of your screens. You can use that feature by changing your status to raise hand, and then I'll see that you want to speak and I'll happily give you the floor. Alternatively, if you prefer to submit your question or comment in the public chat, then please go ahead and do that. I see Simao has just joined and left the floor request. Okay, so the session is broken into 3 parts. I'd like to take you through parts 1 and 2 today. This will take about 45 minutes. We can have questions as we go along or questions at the end. And then the final part is more open. There's a set of tips and tricks that we can look at, which we can really look at if you want to dip into any specific aspect, we can do that. But equally, you can look at the slides during or after the presentation. You'll find them in TD 384 of plenary in the TD series. So the overview I just mentioned, there are 3 parts. The first is very high level strategic. It's about the general principles of how we develop work items, how we approve work items, how we build consensus, and even what is consensus. And we'll look at the specific roles and responsibilities with a focus on leadership roles or management roles within the study group. Next, we'll go to a more practical level. We'll look at the pre-meeting preparation, the execution during the meeting, where we are now, from Study Group 16's point of view, and then the reporting and follow-up activities. And we see that as a journey. It looks linear, it's actually circular, because the follow-up of one meeting feeds directly into the inputs for the next, as I'm sure you're aware, but this is the way we'll envisage it today. And then finally, there's a whole section about 20 or 30 slides, which I'll let you look at your leisure, that looks at some of the ways that we can help you be more effective in your leadership roles. So that's understanding what are the tools and services and how can they best serve your needs. What editing assistance is available, so from a structural point of view or from a use of language or terminology point of view. We have various searches and databases. And then there's two aspects of documentation. One is about consuming documents. So how do we download them? How do we analyze the content in a way that helps us as a group of leaders? And the other is about the document preparation side. So whether you're preparing a contribution or whether you're preparing a TD in your leadership role, what are some tips and tricks to do that most effectively? So we'll look at parts 1 and 2 now. So starting at the top level, first of all, what is the life cycle of a work item? I think this is really quite fundamental, and hopefully we can envisage it in a way that that helps us move forward. So, as you know, member contributions are the driving force of the work of ITUT. So the first step is that the contribution is submitted. It'll then be disposed to a specific question or to plenary, where the experts will make a decision about whether or not to initiate work. So the contribution is a suggestion to start work, and the experts attending the meeting decide whether or not they should go ahead. By agreeing to start the work, implicitly somebody will take a leadership role. Typically we call this person an editor. There is a disclaimer that says if no specific editor is nominated, then the rapporteur for that particular question is the person who takes that role. We'll come to the specific definition of the editor's role later, but for the purposes of work item lifecycle, we can see it as it's a role to maintain the latest baseline text through iterations of sharing a consolidated version and inviting further inputs from the members. So we see this as an iterative process as you go from initiating the work through to a level of maturity that would allow you to start the approval process. And in parallel with this, there may be a liaison activity. So if some of your work is of specific interest to other groups working in similar domains, you can conduct liaison between yourselves and them, seeking feedback and just alerting them of what's going on and inviting comments, suggestions, or updates from their side. So this is quite an organic process at this stage, and the editor's role is really one of coordination. Eventually, that text will be considered mature by the experts, and when it is, it would be submitted to a study group meeting or a working party meeting for consideration about what we do next. So let's assume that the study group is supportive of the work of the experts. They initiate the approval process, and eventually the recommendation or other work item is approved. We'll look in more detail about the approval processes in a few minutes. Once the document's approved, it goes through a final stage of quality control within TSB, who'll proofread the text and make sure that everything is crystal clear and complies with best practice for presenting information. And then we go into a feedback process. So that published text, it becomes liable to revisions, to amendments, corrigenda, or eventually to deletion when it's time, when it's run its course and it's been superseded by some new technology or some new standard. And this then feeds back into an endless loop that once a work item has been created, it will continue and it will evolve as needed by the experts. And just to draw your attention back to the center again, you'll see the green arrows. Member contributions at any of these stages is really vital for the initiation, development, and eventually maintenance of these recommendations. So this may be something that everybody's all aware of, but just a couple of quick reminders on some updates to the A-series recommendations that happened at TSAG last year to A1, A5, A13, and A25. So the first is that normative text, the initiation of new work items require justification from the annex in A1. And there's now an equivalent to that, which is new work items, non-normative work items, need to be justified using a very similar annex in A13. In A5, the A5 contains refinements. One of them would be that the justification TDs, so A1 or A13, needs to be submitted at least 1 day before the meeting. So there's no longer the option to submit justifications at the start of the closing plenary, for example. There's also some clarifications about who exactly qualifies when A5 justification is needed for partnership projects. This is a little detailed, but just to highlight the changes that may have passed by. A13, the other change, as well as the annex, the other change is that A13 now defines not just supplements, but also the other types of non-normative texts. So it explains what they're for and what they are. And finally, A25, which is all about incorporation of text in ITUT recommendations. This is a difficult business, it's highly technical, and A25 has been updated a lot to explain exactly what steps are required if that's the path that you want to go down. There's always the option of referencing external work rather than incorporating, and that's really a discussion about whether you follow the A5 or the A25 path. So again, we're staying at the high level here. So there's a shared responsibility for quality, and that's shared by all of the roles, what we would call leadership roles in the study group. We're not alone. There are guiding texts that can help us. So there's the manual for rapporteurs and editors. This again was updated last September by TSAG. There's the author's guide for drafting recommendations, and this covers a number of core elements. So what is the core material? What is normative versus non-normative content? So that is what defines a standard and what is informative by nature. How do we do referencing, formatting, numbering, spelling, etc.? These are quality checks that are also done by the editing team. In cases when you're revising an existing text, and I know in Study Group 16 you have a tradition of regularly updating texts. When you do that, it's very important to take the latest published text from the web as your baseline. Otherwise, we risk losing some of the refinements and enhancements that come in during the editing process. So the same applies for approved text. The same also applies for TDs. So if you submit a TD, I know that Rosa, who I think is on the call, will take care to add quality, add hyperlinks, make corrections, and so on. And rather than lose those improvements that she's incorporated, we would ask you to use the published version of any TD as your baseline. This becomes good practice, and this is something we can use in other contexts. And I've already mentioned that we have the A1 and A13 justification templates. They help outline what information is required to justify the start of a new work item. And then stepping back from that, this is all publicly available information, but there's also the concept of a quality review. So that could be from the TSB editing team. So that could be a formal request to do a check either about the structure or the content, or if a text is getting close to maturity, you could ask for a full editorial review before approval, which can save a lot of time and improve the quality. But you can also turn to the Secretariat, so Simao and Rosa. You can get in touch with them and ask for various forms of guidance, really at any point before you initiate a new work item, at any point during the development, and also in the post-approval phase when we're getting ready for publication. So let's look now at decision-making and approval procedures. A really high-level principle in ITU and also in ITUT is the concept of consensus. And the aim there is we're looking for win-win decisions. So if we don't have consensus, we have winners and losers, and we don't want that. A corollary of that, an extension of that, is that we avoid voting as much as possible. First, it creates winners and losers. Second, it limits the decision-making to member states, which again excludes those others who have a voice, even if it's not a decision-making voice. We can also distinguish between soft decisions. So these are things like agreement of non-normative text, determination of traditional approval process texts. These are soft decisions. They're not binding. They don't create normative material or they don't create standards. They're a soft decision that supports that work, but they're not hard decisions in their own right. Where we do have definitive decisions, normally this is quantifiable. So for example, during TAP, which I know you don't use in study group 16, but during the consultation phase, there's a requirement for a 70% affirmation rate. So again, we're not voting, but we're getting the temperature of the room and a sense of what level of support there is. And in this case, in a more definitive way. The approval process is, as I'm sure you're aware, there are 4 main approval processes. One is the traditional approval process. This is for regulatory or policy standards, which I think is never applied in study group 16. AAP is for technical standards, which is where the majority of, or that is the means by which the majority of your texts would be approved. Where necessary, the assembly, hopefully later this year, early next year, has full decision-making powers. So it can make approval decisions. This is useful in a number of different circumstances, including sensitive or difficult standards, or cases with consequences that apply across all of the study groups, or occasionally just to get it done faster. If the timing of study group meetings is not convenient, it is possible to go for faster approval directly at the assembly if everything is aligned correctly. And finally, we have not technically an approval process, but the agreement of other texts, non-normative texts. This is done by the agreement of the group at typically the closing plenary. I see that Simao has requested the floor. Please go ahead.
Just a comment. You mentioned that the TAP is not normally seen in study group 16. That's true. We have one text, an old text that is TAP T.35 that has not been updated since the early 2000s. But there is one work item under discussion right now that we have agreed to transform from AAP to TAP, even though there are another contribution that is proposing to change it from a recommendation to a supplement, etc. But the matter of face recognition is considered to be by many member states to be of regulatory nature. So work in that area might create a number of work items in study group 16 that would need to follow the TAP process. We are still discussing it during this meeting, but this is just a comment around that, so that the TAP might be coming to study group 16 as well. Over.
That's great. Thank you, Simo, for that. Well, in that case, what I hope I can do is demystify TAP. I think it has a reputation as being very complicated. Hopefully what I can do is shed some light on that and explain it's actually business as usual, and the process itself is essentially quite simple. We'll get into that very shortly. So I'm glad it's going to be of relevance to you guys. Just to give you an idea of how many texts are approved by each mechanism, you can see that we're strongly dominated by AAP. This is an indication that we're strongly dominated by technical standards. We do other types of standards, and there's also a reasonable proportion, so about 8 to 10% of our texts are approved by agreement. So these are informative texts to support the work, but are not standards themselves. Simo, if you don't want the floor again, I'm going to click on the cross to stop your floor request. Did you want to speak again? Okay, you've withdrawn. Okay, so here we are. This is the traditional approval process. This is actually the only approval process, or it was up until 2000, when there was an awareness that a lot of standards are essentially technical in nature, and the level of approval needed to speed up the work and to be effective in the industry required the implementation of the AAP. So this is really the way things have always been done traditionally up until about 20 years ago. We're just going to look at the level of the concepts, and hopefully what you'll see is when you look into Resolution 1, Section 9, you'll see that these steps are embodied in a lot of detail, but it really is no more complicated than this. Stage 1 is that the experts themselves consider the standard to be mature. So this normally means the experts have been involved in developing the standard. But in order to get to a a decision, the text has to be submitted to the study group or working party meeting, which gives it a much broader view. So all of the experts attending the meeting can see what's going on. And what we would look for there is a declaration of determination. This is the equivalent of consent. So we could call it first stage approval. And it says that the experts present at the study group meeting have agreed that the text is mature and ready to start the approval process. The next stage is the consultation period. So this is at least 3 months, and it leads up to the next study group or working party meeting. It's a consultation that's initiated by a TSB circular, and it invites member states to tell us whether or not they support the idea of considering the text for approval. So it's not a decision about approving, it's a decision about whether or not the approval should be considered at the meeting. After the consultation, we'll go back to the study group meeting, and that's the point where approval or not, that decision is made. There's always the possibility, not just at stage 4, at any stage, to escalate or to transfer the text to the assembly, to WTSA, for approval, and if necessary, to the vote. So these are covered in Resolution 1. The voting could happen, of course, at WTSA or at the study group meeting. It has happened. We try to avoid it because it goes against the earlier principle of consensus building. And then finally, it's a formality that once the decision to approve or not to approve has been made, that's then announced to the broader membership of ITUT to let them know what's happened. So it does look detailed and complicated, the TAP. These are the 5 steps necessary, and the exact timing, the exact content of those documents and those steps, the councillor Simel will offer advice at the right time to help guide you through this process. So it's really nothing to be worried about, and in many ways it's equivalent to what you're familiar with in AAP. So speaking of AAP, this is relatively quick and flexible, and it's based on a lot of the same concepts. So stage 1 is identical. The experts themselves consider the text to be mature. The document is submitted to the study group meeting or working party meeting for consent, which is equivalent to determination. It just says the group of experts present believe that the text is mature and ready for the approval process. The text is then put out to a 4-week last call period, and assuming no comments are received, the text is approved. There are variations on that if comments are received at various points, but essentially it's an online process with an option to return to the study group if for any reason issues come up that can't be resolved online. So the vast majority of texts are approved either after last call or shortly afterwards, after a period of additional review or some other sort of consideration. And then because we have so many texts going through this process, rather than announcing the decision in a circular, we have a bi-weekly AAP announcement. And what this does, it lists all of the status changes of all of the texts currently going through AAP. So it could be launched into the level consent or last call, and then progresses through the different statuses until an approval decision is made. WTSA, although it's higher level, Zhong Lao, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Clark. Thank you very much for giving us this very nice presentation. And the study group chair, I also already encourage people to come as soon as they can, as much as they can. So it's very important. But here I have a rather specific question regarding the previous slide, the TAP process. Yeah, so Clark here. So in step 3, in step 4, decision to approve or not. So here, so for the decision to be positive, how much is the percentage of positive votes, and to stop something being TAP approved. So how much is the minimum percentage of negative votes?
Okay, thank you. So in fact, the percentage only applies at the level of consultation. So 70% or more of responses received from member states must be positive in order to consider the text for approval. So, but this is at stage 3. At stage 4, actually, I see Sima wants to jump in. Sima, would you rather take this question?
You can continue to answer, and then I'll jump on it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so the consultation period has a percentage associated with it. The decision at the study group is a decision like any other, which is it's based on consensus, and the decision to approve will be announced by the chairman, presumably by yourself, Noah, by the chairman, typically at the closing plenary, based on a sense that there is consensus among the experts. In terms of TAP, the different membership categories have different levels of right to support or to disagree. Ultimately, TAP is a decision made by member states. So the consultation is exclusively for member states. The decision making is for member states. And the options really at the decision making are either you could have unanimity or at least no disagreement, in which case the text would be approved. You could have some dissenting voices, in which case the text can still be approved. You could have reservations expressed even by member states and still go for approval. Typically, those reservations would be recorded in the meeting report and potentially in the text itself, saying that one or more member states had reservations. And at some point, if you believe there is not support to go ahead with approval, you can have the status not approved, or you can relaunch determination, or you could make some other decision. You may send the text up to WTSA. I believe there is an option for a veto. I think, Sima, I'm sure you'll correct me. I think that there is a veto of that can be used by member states to block approval. But Sima, please go ahead. You're still muted.
Sorry, I was jumping around the sessions. Yes. So the issue with consultation is that the purpose of the consultation is not the approve or not approval. The question that is posed by this consultation, that's number 3, a few weeks, no, 2 or 3 months before the meeting itself, is the question is, can the meeting that will be coming up consider for approval the text? So in my understanding of the rules, that is not always how it is implemented or followed by the members that are replying to this circular, is no, if there is an agreement, this could be useful for the organizations that for the member states that would be unable to come to a certain meeting. Usually the right of decision making is only for those that are physically present at the meeting. We are now in an exception period where we are allowing for decision making decisions in the virtual meetings because of the COVID emergency, but in a normal situation, that's the physical meeting, only those physically present. So if there is an administration that would be prevented from coming, would they still be okay that this is considered for approval? So this is, I think, a step that is taken to ensure that those that will be present at the meeting will, I mean, their decision will be, inclusive of all the member states, of the 193 member states. Now, when you come to the meeting, so there is no vote. TAP is no vote, so there is no percentage. And there are discussions and debates and clauses and rules and the certain workflow, but the bottom line is a single member state opposing to the approval can block the approval of the recommendation. As simple as that. And so because of respect to sovereign rights of member states, that's the principle that is maintained here. There is a similar process for in AAP when it goes back to the study group, where you need at least 2 member states to block the approval of a recommendation. And so this was felt to be a break of the rights of member states, the sovereign rights of member states. And this was in, I think, in 2005 TISAG meeting. This was discussed, and the decision was to allow during the study group. So when AAP recommendation is sent back to the study group, the one member state can change the approval process in the middle. They can say, sorry, but I want to change this from AAP to TAP. In the study group decision meeting, in the study group phase of the AAP. So after last call took place and then it's sent back to study group, at that point, if a member state wants, they can say, I'm sorry, but I want to change this to TAP. In the current rules, after consent is taken, until it goes back to study group, there is no possibility to change the process. Now, the changing process can be either before consent is done or after it goes back to study group. So at that moment, it can be changed to TAP and then follows the normal rules of now having a determination at that meeting, have to wait until the next study group meeting. And at that study group meeting, the member state can have their vote, to state their position, to oppose the approval of recommendation, and that blocks the approval. It's different in WTSA because in WTSA, it is 50% approval. So if you send a recommendation for request for approval, that was the last option, I think, or the third option in the list that Robert showed, I think one slide before than that. That was, yes, there was a list that you had of the text. Doesn't matter. When you send to WTSA, then it is either by consensus. There is a consensus to approve, and if there is a vote, then it is 50% plus 1 is the approval. So there it is a vote. Sorry for this long explanation, but it's not so simple. Over.
Thank you, Simão. So, Noah, I hope that answers your question. Essentially, there is no voting, but there is a standard consensus building process that leads to the decision at step 4. Okay.
Yes,
so
Clark, Simão, thank you very much. It's very clear now. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. I think from experience, when there is a lack of support, when there is disagreement, this is normally signaled quite clearly in advance. And so these different options that Simão described, it shouldn't be sudden. It shouldn't suddenly be revealed during the closing plenary. Normally there's some warning that there's disagreement, and then the options can become more obvious. So hopefully, in any case, hopefully that's a little clearer. Okay, Simão mentioned WTSA decision making. In fact, because all of the key decision makers are present or are eligible to be present at the assembly, the group has full decision making power, and the approval process is actually very simple. So initially, the study group asks for consideration by WTSA. So typically, this would happen if another approval approach didn't work. Not always. Sometimes, from a timing point of view, this is done spontaneously. But in any case, the study group asks for consideration by WTSA. The chairman of WTSA would normally lead the discussion and eventually the decision making. And then the member states will decide what they want to do. So they may call an ad hoc to resolve issues there and then. They may approve, they may not approve. Essentially, the decision is made by consensus at the assembly, retaining the option, as always, to go to a vote if necessary. But that is typically last option. And finally, as a courtesy to those who weren't present, or for the records, we would announce the approval decision in a circular WTSA. But in fact, WTSA is one of the simplest approval styles. And then the final one is for non-normative text agreement. This is simply that the experts, as usual, consider the text to be mature. They submit it to a study group meeting for approval by agreement, and that's it. We have a list of the different types of non-normative text that can be approved this way. It's probably a good time to mention that these slides, they're best viewed in slideshow modes that we're looking at now, but there are footnotes on every slide pointing you to the various resources that may help understand the background of these topics we're discussing. Okay, I realize we're making slower progress than I would have hoped, so I'll try and condense this a little bit. Looking at consensus building. First of all, what is consensus? It means different things to different people. It could mean unanimity or unopposed agreement. It could mean the absence of sustained opposition, which is not quite the same thing. This is the definition adopted by ISO IEC. It could be substantial agreement, but ultimately within ITU and ITUT, it is the chairman's judgment. It's a judgment call. In order to achieve consensus, the way discussions and proposals are presented can have a big impact on how the group responds. So look at these 4 examples. Asking, are there any objections, is different to asking, is there support? This is pushing the discussion in 2 different directions, essentially asking the same thing, but the way it's phrased can change the impact. You could also make a statement, I see no objections. Or you could propose a way forward that starts, normally the group would decide this, or normally under these circumstances, we would take that decision. So this is about phrasing the opinion of yourselves as chairs to drive the work forward. Also, in order to build consensus, it's useful sometimes to step back. There can be times when discussions are circular and there's no progress by the group. At that time, it can be useful to step back, to summarize the positions at play, and to say, what is the decision that you need to make today, or in this meeting, or right now? Sometimes we still can't move forward, and in that case, there have to be mechanisms to relieve the tension, to break the deadlock. So one option is to just stop the discussion for the moment. You can take a coffee break, a comfort break. You can sleep on it, meaning come back the following day. You could make a proposal, maybe a compromise proposal, or maybe a choice to go down path A or path B. You may recognize that the involved experts need to take time out away from the rest of the group for those who are interested in this topic and have something to say, to go and hold an ad hoc, to make a decision between themselves, and to present that outcome back to the rest of the group. This can reduce the pressure. It can be more informal, and the various players can find a way forward in terms that suit themselves, that can drive the work or allow the work to progress. Ultimately, if deadlock still can't be broken, even at the point of final decision, it is possible to record that voice of dissent in either the meeting report or in the eventual recommendation, or in both. So even if there's disagreement, we can still progress. So we don't have to be blocked and locked into a position where no decision can be made. So what can you do as the leader of discussions? First of all, it's important to come into the discussions keeping the end in mind. It's possible that some participants have a particular concern that to them needs to be resolved before anything can happen, but it's important to keep the longer term in mind. As chairman, as leader, it's not just important that you remain impartial, it's important that you're seen to be impartial. And so how you conduct yourself before, during, and after these discussions is very important for reassuring everybody that that the decision making is impartial and is driven by the experts. This doesn't mean you're not involved in the discussion. So this is where a bit of balance is needed. So as chairman, you are involved in the discussions. So Listen with care to what people are saying, follow the discussions carefully, and also be sensitive to the different ways that people can communicate. Some cultures, some backgrounds, some individuals prefer to be quieter, others are more verbose. So there needs to be an understanding of those different factors in play. This is the point I was going to make, was as a chairman, you may actively involve and be responsive in the discussions. That doesn't mean being silent, and it doesn't mean dominating. It means somewhere in between the two, playing your part. Then we get onto another balance point. First of all, you need to give everybody the chance to talk. And so we have the new floor request system in this application, which is very useful. It means that each person can talk, and it becomes easier to manage the list. But equally, it allows you to close the list. So everyone needs the chance to speak, but also there has to be a point where the debate is closed. And it's a difficult business to find that right balance point where people feel that enough has been heard to make a decision without being caught in an endless loop and without blocking people before they've had a chance to express themselves. So this is really an art form, and this is why consensus building is considered an art form. It's important during and after decision making that all contributors to this process are recognized. So that includes those who have written contributions, who have presented, who have participated in the discussions, and also as a way of keeping the flow of meetings going from one session to the next. It's important to thank the captioners, the interpreters, and also, I think I can say this, the TSB staff who support this work, whether it's the technical support for these e-meetings or whether it's a secretariat support from Simao and Rosa, who do a lot of work in the background to make these discussions possible and easy and successful. Roles and responsibilities. It's really important to understand these. Because there are one or two areas where there is ambiguity, not necessarily among the leadership team, among yourselves, but it can exist among the other experts. So the leadership roles are the study group chairman, potentially vice chairman, working party chair, vice chair, the rapporteurs responsible for coordinating the work of a question, liaison rapporteurs, editors, and the TSB secretariat. All of these people, all of these roles are considered to be leadership roles. Between them, the leadership team shares responsibility for different elements. So ensuring the process is followed correctly, ensuring the quality, whatever that means, the quality of the outputs, the quality of the text, and so on. And specifically, what are often called the big five. So these are meeting reports that come out of a meeting, the documents or the list of documents for major decisions. So this is the text for approval, agreement, and so on. Updates the work program, which really is, it's a record of the work and the progress of the work. And by implication, this includes leadership roles. So when a new work item is created, an editor is assigned that role. And also when a new work item is created, it's added to the work program. So this is an essential record of where we are and where we've been and where we're going. You would typically generate outgoing liaison statements. It's important as an outcome of a meeting to communicate what's needed. And finally, plans for the future study group, working party, and other interim events. The senior leadership roles are fairly well understood. So study group chairmen are responsible for providing strategic leadership for the whole of the group. Their job is to facilitate consensus building, either directly or through nurturing an environment of consensus building among the other experts. Their job is to assert the working methods. One trivial example is the use of the intellectual property rights inquiry, making sure that all of the procedures are followed to make sure that all of our decisions are legitimate. They're there to ensure a more general and more abstract concept of fairness and openness across the study group. We want to welcome new players. We want to give everybody a voice. They're also there to drive the work forward, to make proposals on a way forward when the time is right. So these are easy things to say, very difficult things to do. Working party chairman, in many ways, their work directly supports the work and the role of the study group chairman. And they're selected by some very strict criteria. So on one hand, It's about their technical knowledge and their technical experience of standards making, but also it's about managerial skills, proven managerial skills. At a practical level, there needs to be continuity of participation. So the working party chairs need to be there for all of the study group and working party meetings, which is a heavy commitment over a 4-year study period cycle. What do we expect of working party chairs? Well, they should report to the study group plenaries, they should chair their own working party meetings, and they manage and oversee the work between meetings. The role of the rapporteur becomes slightly less clear. This isn't always understood by the newcomers or the other experts. So the rapporteurs, like the other management positions, leadership positions, are supposed to possess technical knowledge, experience, and management skills. You can see that's the same as the working party chairs. They're also expected to participate in study group and working party meetings, as well as the rapporteur group meetings that they might hold. So this is, if anything, an even greater burden in terms of time over the course of a study period. Once again, their job is to assert the rules and the working methods. They ensure compliance with the drafting rules. So this really makes sure that all of the key elements and all of the quality elements required in a draft text are complied with. Their job is also to look around to see what the other groups, the other questions, the other study groups, the other standards development organizations, what everybody else is doing, and take responsibility for coordination, either receiving inputs from other groups or sending inputs to others to let people know what's going on and make sure that we address this key question of gaps and overlaps in the standardization landscape. The rapporteur's job is huge and very complicated, but rapporteurs shouldn't feel that they're doing this alone. They can always turn to their own leadership for advice and guidance. Sometimes there are associate rapporteurs or at least editors working on specific texts. So this is among the group of experts. And also, we, as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of support in TSB. We have decades of experience between the various teams, the editing team and the secretariat. So we're here to help and help you plan and help you execute to get good results. So sticking to rapporteurs and looking specifically now at rapporteur group meetings. So it's really important if travel is involved, and obviously that's not the case right now, but when travel is involved, face-to-face meetings should be planned or confirmed at least 2 months ahead. And there has to be sufficient attendance and sufficient contributions to go ahead with the meeting. There's no point in having a discussion without these criteria. E-meetings, because there's no travel, but there is scheduling to be looked at, they should typically be confirmed at least 2 weeks ahead. And we normally do this over the mailing lists just to make sure there's no clash of meeting schedules and that there's a general agreement to go ahead with the session. During and after the meeting, before, during and after the meeting, the rapporteur is responsible for managing the meeting documents. So taking on board the contributions, planning out the agenda to make sure that these topics are discussed at the right time and so on. They're also responsible for applying the rules related to invited experts. So this is a nuanced area of its own, but it is a responsibility. When it's necessary to have a non-member participate, there are rules that apply, and it's up to the chair of that group, typically a rapporteur in this case, to make sure the rules are followed. The rapporteur is also responsible for outputting the necessary documents. So as a minimum, all rapporteur group meetings should output a meeting report, and that should typically be submitted as a TD to the next study group meeting. Another typical output might be a draft text or liaison statements and so on. Liaison representatives, these people, they have to come from either a member state or a sector member, as opposed to an associate, because their role is to be involved in multiple groups, and obviously associates can only participate in the work of their own group. Their job is to ensure effective liaison in many different ways. So one of those ways would be to attend the meetings of the other groups and represent, for example, study group 16 at the work of other groups. They should participate in correspondence activities when necessary. And also, we would normally expect liaison representatives to submit an activity report to study group plenaries. This isn't always enforced, but it is good practice. It lets everybody else know exactly how the study group is engaging with the others in the landscape. Editors are probably one of the most misunderstood roles in the study groups, and so I'll focus a little bit on what they are and what they're not. Their job is to assist the rapporteur in preparing the draft texts. In that sense, the rapporteur still holds on to responsibility for quality, so they can delegate the work, but they don't delegate the responsibility. The editor is not the author, and people outside the study groups can often make this mistake. The editor is not the author. Their job is to incorporate the changes based on documented submissions with the agreement of all of the other experts. So their role is really one of coordination, and it's almost a secretarial role in a sense, that their job is not to represent their own point of view. Their job is to represent the consensus that's been built within the group about the changes that can be made to the text. That doesn't mean that the editor can't make changes on their own, but typically this is by following editorial requests. So this might be typographical formatting. It may be an agreement to change certain terminology or to reorganize the text. Whatever it is, it's clearly defined for the editor to go ahead and execute a decision that's made by the experts as a whole. Now, none of this means that the editor can't contribute technical content. They may. What's important, though, is that they should say, right now, I'm representing my parent organization. I'm no longer the editor of this text. They would make their proposal. They would present it in the same way as any other participant would do. And then they would revert back to their role of editor. So they can contribute on exactly the same basis as the other experts. And it's really important to do that and to let everybody know what's happening. Like the rapporteur, the editor can turn to the TSB editing team or the study group secretariat at any time. We can offer practical help or other forms of guidance. The TSB secretariat, so we're here to help. We're a relatively small organization of about 65 people supporting the work of all of the study groups, all of the focus groups, and all of the other activities that are going on in the ET sector. We're made up of the TSB director and the deputy director, that's Chase Ubley and Reinhard Scholl. We have the chiefs of the study group department, Bilal Jamusi, and the operations and publications department, this is Alex Ntoko. Within each study group, we have a secretariat, which is made up of a counselor, sometimes called an advisor, and an assistant. So typically, all of the administrative work you see as experts is being done by those two individuals. So again, back to Simao and Rosa. And those of us, the colleagues, were very well aware that Study Group 16 is about as big and demanding as it gets, so they do a terrific job. We have the TSB logistics team, who take care of practical aspects of hosting meetings. The registration team, who take care of registration and participation related issues. And then we have the real background guys, the electronic working methods, the IT development, and the e-meetings team. The e-meetings team obviously have stepped up their game in recent months and supported countless of these sessions. But we expect that their role will continue to be relevant in the future, whether it's for e-meetings or remote participation at physical meetings. And then there's the TSB editing team I've mentioned several times. Okay, that's the end of part one. Please let me know if you have any questions about these high-level principles about what we're doing and how we do it. Okay, I see no requests for the floor, so I'll go straight into part two. So we'll look now at the more practical aspects of the work. We mentioned earlier that one of the roles of the chairs and more generally for the leadership team is to start with the end in mind. So with that in mind, before the meeting, we should focus on, first of all, the content. We mentioned the big 5 outcomes: the reports, future plans, documents for approval, updates to the work program, and liaison statements. So going into the study group meeting, we know that these will be the big outcomes. So what can we do in advance and during the meeting to best serve those? That's content. The second thing is time management. And I think this is particularly critical when you have a fully virtual meeting working to a very tight time schedule. So it's important to manage the sequence of events and to then manage the time effectively. One interesting way of looking at the inputs and the outputs of a meeting is to say that each of the valued inputs corresponds to an equivalent valued output. So more specifically, the agenda of the meeting will lead directly to the report. So the sequence and the way the discussions are held will lead to the outcomes that are listed in the meeting report. Another input, which is expected for all of the study group meetings, is a series of reports on the interim activities, and that corresponds to plans for future rapporteur group meetings and e-meetings. We come into a meeting with the existing status of work items. So this is existing work items, new work items. This can be based on member contributions, and it can also be based on the latest draft of text that have maybe been developed during e-meetings since the last study group meeting. And these will lead to decisions. So this would either be text for approval, determination, consent, or it may just be work program updates to say that the work continued during the study group meeting, and the latest version of this baseline text can be found at such and such a location. And then the last is incoming liaison statements can often lead to outgoing liaison statements. So there are exceptions. You may receive information that needs no action. You may respond to incoming liaison statements, or you may send spontaneous liaison statements when the work requires it. So looking again at time management, the collective letter, the meeting announcement, contains the first draft of a time management plan. This is normally annexed to the collective letter, and it often references a TD, and that TD will be maintained showing the latest updated time management plan. As part of the leadership team, we as a secretariat really want to cooperate with you as effectively as we can. And obviously plans change, and logistical constraints can limit what we do. Ironically, this affects us less with electronic meeting rooms than it does with physical meeting rooms. We can be a lot more fluid and flexible with electronic meeting rooms. What we would ask, though, is during the planning stages, please think about any joint sessions or ad hoc sessions that you may need. So this is really talking to the chairs and the rapporteurs. When would you need to meet outside normal working hours? We're very happy to accommodate, but we do need advance notice. What is your need for remote participation? And do you have any social events or special requests, information sessions, and so on? What we would say is during the preparation phase or during the meeting, please let the secretariat know as early as you can. We really want to give you good service, but you can help us by letting us know at the right time. Looking now at how the management team might prepare itself. So typically there are management team meetings well before the meeting, just before the meeting, during the meeting, and often as a follow-up to wash up any final issues. The purpose of these management team meetings is to have a high-level coordination and discussion between the management team. Each of those people will have detailed understanding of precisely what's happening in their domain, and so this is an opportunity to share that information. So especially the working party and study group chairs are aware of any hot topics that might be developing. This is an opportunity to look at the overall time plan, and probably their joint sessions is crucial, that you find opportunities to hold joint sessions at times that are going to be convenient for all of the involved participants. The management team meeting would certainly address any hot topics that are expected. So if, for example, a decision is expected about a TAP recommendation, either its determination or approval, this would be a good time to discuss this. Essentially, so there are no surprises during the opening or closing plenary meeting. It's really about avoiding surprises to the extent possible. I've mentioned joint sessions, joint activities. And this is also an opportunity for considering coordination, also marketing of the group as well, so that letting other people know about the great work that's going on in Study Group 16 and other activities that you do alongside, for example, JVET or the JPEG group, MPEG group. Looking at meeting report preparation. So this can be done in a number of different ways, and it's certainly not the Secretariat's role to tell you how to do it. But there are some best practices that have evolved over the years that can help your work, make it easier, and ensure the quality. A typical way is to build the skeleton for your meeting report early. So this could mean you know you're going to have an opening session, you know there'll be discussion of certain contributions, and you know there's going to be decision making. So this can be scheduled in, and this can be reflected in the report. And then it makes it a lot easier to capture the decisions and discussions as the meeting goes on. So you don't have to remember it after the event. There's already a placeholder for you to record all of the essential steps. What's not so easy is the report structure has to be a lot of contradictory things. It has to be comprehensive, but it also has to be succinct. So it has to include all the necessary information, but it has to be brief. It should be clear and well organized. It should remain objective. And so if there are diverging views, those should be reflected objectively in a way that each of the participants can agree to. So if a member state or a sector member wants to make a certain stance, typically what we would do is invite them to submit a written statement, and that written statement would be included in the meeting report. So the words are exactly what the submitter wants them to be, and it was the group that decided to accept that this text will be added to the meeting report. That way you have complete transparency and you give a voice to those who want to have a voice. Also, the report structure should be results focused. So it can be tempting to be pulled into the discussion and keep the discussion going. But to the extent possible, the report should focus on what the outcomes were. I've mentioned before that some of these roles, the chairman and rapporteur roles in particular, are incredibly busy. So it is possible to delegate some of these tasks. So for example, the working party chair may invite the rapporteurs and other experts to provide inputs to the working party report, for example. During the meeting, it's really a question of what we'd say, be there and cope. So be present in the meeting, plan as far as you can, but essentially respond to the evolving situation as it comes along. So this, first of all, it means finding out what's going on. So maintain good relations with the other colleagues. Make sure you have your lines of communication so you know what's happening. There's a question of reporting upwards and downwards. So if something's evolving, if you're a rapporteur and something is evolving in your question, it's important to let the management team know again so there are no surprises. You may also want to seek advice and guidance or invite the participation of a working party or study group chair in the discussions so that they're fully aware of what's going on and may intervene if they wish. At a practical level, back to this logistics question, you may find you want extra sessions, you may want to change a session or cancel it, and you may make a last-minute decision to request or cancel remote participation. So this red asterisk again, please let us know early. We can provide great service, but we really need to know in advance. Without making excuses, some of our colleagues who provide support services are day workers. So even if the Secretariat is working at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, it's quite possible that some of our logistics colleagues have already gone home. So if you want a meeting room assigned for 8 o'clock the next morning, we can't always provide what you want. And we don't like doing that. We don't want to disappoint you. Chair meetings. Without getting too complicated, there is a legal framework within which we operate and within which we chair meetings. These are described in the ITU general rules, the Constitution and Convention. All of these apply at the level of ITU as a whole, the whole organization. Specifically in ITU-T, we have WTSA Resolution 1, which defines the rules that apply within, or many of the rules that apply within the T sector or within the work of the study groups. But more importantly, all of these general principles and specific rules, they're already embodied in the working methods of ITU-T. So even if you never read any of these other documents, if you follow along with how decision making is done and you get a sense of how discussions flow, how decisions are made, how they're recorded, you'll very quickly understand the rules that are behind them. And so there is this consistency between the high-level rules and their implementation. So chairing meetings is really an expression of those rules using common practice. And so typically, by the time somebody gets to a position of rapporteur, working party, or chair, they would typically have gained a lot of experience in participating in those meetings. And so it becomes second nature. Handling interventions, not everybody knows this, but once again, following common practice would guide you in the right direction. It's up to the session chairman to give delegates permission to intervene. So that would typically be that the delegate requests the floor and the chairman gives the floor. Occasionally, the chairman might give the floor without being asked. For example, if a question comes up where a rapporteur may be well positioned to answer, the chairman may just give the floor directly. I'm the world's worst for this. It's really important to consider non-native English speakers when we're intervening. So I have a tendency to speak too fast, and I apologize for that. I do try to slow myself down. And that's not just for the other participants, but also for the captioners, which I know is applicable in question 26, and the interpreters when they're used, sign language or spoken language interpreters. For those reasons, please speak slowly and distinctly, slower than I speak. And normally you would start an intervention by saying who you are and what is your role or affiliation. And I think general best practice is that in electronic meetings, that's more important than ever. We can see on the screen who's speaking, but we don't necessarily know who that person is. So it's useful to say at the outset, this is me and this is the role in which I speak. That's also useful in the case I mentioned earlier, where an editor intervenes on behalf of their parent organization. So an editor may say, this is John Smith, I now represent this organization, as opposed to the appointed role within the study group. And at the end, it's quite useful to say, this concludes my intervention, or to follow the example Simao gave, which is to say over, which is old-fashioned radio speak, to say, I've finished my intervention. Finally, one quick point, which is about reporting and follow-up. So obviously the meeting report can't be finalized until it's concluded, although it is good practice to keep that meeting report as up to date as possible, and potentially to submit an early draft to the closing meeting of that group, which can then be updated according to any final decisions. There are liaison statements that need to be sent following a study group meeting, but of course, incoming liaison statements can arrive at any time. And so there's a constant process of monitoring that communication. And if an urgent response is needed, we do have the right, or you as leaders do have the right, to draft response liaisons between study group meetings, as long as the decision-making process that was used is documented. So for example, a response might be sent by the management team in between study group meetings, in which case that would be documented in the liaison statement that's sent. There's a constant process of monitoring the interim activities, typically the e-meetings and rapporteur group meetings, but there's also correspondence activities or other forms of participation in one another's groups. And also, as the leadership team, one of your really important roles from an ITU or ITUT perspective is your role in promoting the work of ITU to those outside. So as well as your affiliations to your parent organizations, you also act as an ambassador for the work of ITU and ITUT. And this can be in very practical terms, attending conferences, attending other events, and speaking on behalf of the other experts. And as I think I said at the very start, this is not a linear journey. It really can be seen as a cycle. And so one of the outcomes of a meeting is the start of the preparations for the next study group meeting, or in this year, WTSA. I'm going to stop there. We are just ahead of schedule. The remaining slides we can jump into if you have a specific question, but I would invite you to look at TD 384 of plenary, if you're interested in some efficiency measures, so learning about some of the resources we have available and some of the ways you can get best value out of the various tools and services that we've developed. It can be a little detailed, but you can go through the slides quickly if you wish. And as with the tools and the services, and as with the rest of the content, please feel free at any time to contact the Secretariat, or feel free to contact me if you have any questions about anything that's covered here. My contact details are in the TD I just mentioned. With that, that's all I have to say, but I'll be very willing to answer any questions you may have, either in the chat or by taking the floor. Thank you.
Hi, Rob. Thank you very much for all these long details. There is a lot to learn. It's good to have this organized and structured so people can review and come back to them. I think it's a very valuable approach. And if there are no more questions, maybe we could stop here. I just want to mention that we have recorded sessions, so the idea is to make this recording available for you to take a look later. So this is, I guess, your last opportunity for asking your questions. It seems not, so thank you very much, Rob. Again, thank you for your valuable time for maintaining, keep us informed on this integrative view of all the working methods and considerations in ITU. Thank you.
Thank you, Simo. It's my pleasure. I would just like to wish everybody all the best for the remainder of the meeting. Really, at any time, if you have any questions, please feel free to approach Simao or Rosa or myself, and we'll be very happy to help. So what I'll do is I'll add a hyperlink in the TD. We'll publish a revised TD 384, including a hyperlink to this recording, should you want to come back or recommend it to anybody else. So with that, I thank you very much.